All right, so here's the agenda for today. So I'm going to do a little introduction of who I am. I'm going to go a little bit deeper in terms of my identities, my journey through higher education and so forth. And the reason why I'm going to do that is because I want to show you a strategy that you can use to think about your identities. That way you can utilize that in mostly your statement of purpose, but also if they're asking you for your personal statement or even a research statement, you want to draw from your experiences, your identities, and what molded you to the point that you are right now, and what's motivating you to go to graduate school. So I'm going to give you a little example of how I went about, thinking about my identities, thinking about my journey through higher education, thinking about the reasons why I want to go to grad school, because that's really what they're asking you in your statement of purpose. So you want to do this activity by yourself when you are maybe brainstorming ideas for your statement of purpose or really your application as a whole. Then we're going to go through every element of the graduate school application in more detail. So we're going to go over the online application form. We're going to go over letters of recommendation, resume and CV, standardized test scores, writing samples, and then statement of purpose. We're going to go deeper into that just because it's my favorite topic. And I think it's a crucial component of your graduate school application. I do also have, if you watched my last video, I do have my Harvard Graduate School of Education application right here with me. So I'm going to give you examples of exactly what I'm looking at in terms of all these elements and why I decided to do things the way I did. Yeah, so you can get more insight on how to go about filling out all these components of the application. Then we're going to review and critique one statement of purpose that I pulled from one of you guys. And we're going to go ahead. I haven't made any comments yet. I did read it over and made sure that it would be a good example. And so we're going to go over it together so we can kind of see what this person can improve on and how they can make themselves more competitive for graduate school. Then at the end, we're going to do a live Q&A. I only allocated 2 hours for this presentation. So I am going to be going deep into all these elements here. So we might not have time for the Q&A just because I do have other things going on. But I'm going to try to get through it and within 2 hours, but we'll see. All right, so who am I? So when you're thinking about your identities, who you are, I think a great strategy would be to do free writes, but also like kind of look at pictures that you've taken throughout your higher education journey or really your life, just to kind of see, your stories, right? If you watch all my videos, I do emphasize storytelling. It's important for your statement of purpose. And I'll go more deeper into that when we get to that point, but here's my story of who I am. And keep in mind that I'm like very brief. I'm not telling like every little story within the larger story. I'm going brief in terms of my identities and why I'm sharing this. So think about, why am I sharing this when you're thinking about your application and your statement of purpose? Why am I sharing this information? And why is it relevant to my to me pursuing graduate school, to me pursuing my program, to me pursuing the career that I want to pursue, etc. So let's go ahead. I have some pictures of myself here. All right, so again, my name's Ivan Valdovinos, and I'm gonna share with you my journey through higher education and really my life. And we're gonna start off with the picture up here and then weave into like a little snake river looking thing. So the first picture here is of me when I was 2 years old. So my family is actually from Mexico, and right after I was born here in California, my family moved down. They immigrated to Mexico, and we lived there for the first 4 years of my life. And the reason why I want to share this is because I wanted to kind of share a little bit about my family background. So my parents are immigrants to the country, the United States, and they came here when I was 4 years old. Although I was a US citizen and moved down to Mexico and then back, I did see a lot of privileges that I had because of this immigration status, right? So I do come from a mixed status family, which means that half of my family is undocumented, which means that they don't have US citizenship. And then the other half of my family does have US citizenship, which means that we are able to access certain opportunities here in the US that, let's say my sister, for example, couldn't access. And so when I was going through like elementary school, secondary school, and really all of the US higher education systems, I was able to access free financial aid to pay for college, for example. I was able to access different things like, let's say, free and reduced lunch. I didn't have to pay for for lunch at school. And that was because of my US citizenship. And so I saw that my older sister, she wasn't able to go to college right after high school because she wasn't able to afford it. My family wasn't able to afford it because we were a low income family. And so she ended up not going to college because of that reason. And so these identities, this immigration status really shaped the way I view education as a system, but also the way that I portray my research interests, my career interests, and the reasons why I wanted to pursue education as a career. And if you look at the next photo down here, we see agricultural workers. So my family, my parents in particular, they work in agriculture, and my dad still does to this day. And he's been working in agriculture for, I think, over 30 years now. And that's the line of work that I've been ingrained in, that I've seen. And so my family comes from this background. And so whenever I speak about this, I talk about agricultural work, undocumented people, bilingualism, because most undocumented people speak Spanish, and at least in my context, and you see all these hardships that they do endure when they are working in the field and the outcomes of this. And so what my dad did with me when I was, I think I was like 16, I think it was when I could legally work, I guess, he decided to take me out to work with him in the field so I can see, what hard work looks like, and pretty much just give me a lesson, or what we call in Spanish a consejo, in order for me to think like, to want to pursue higher education versus this line of work. Because if I didn't pursue higher ed, most of my peers, most of my friends, family, they end up resorting to working in the fields because they are not able to get a job because they didn't finish high school or because they didn't go to college. And so they resort to this line of work. And so my dad wanted me to not resort to that. And so he took me out there and had me work for a couple days. I think it was like a week actually. And then I was like, I'm done. I can't do this. It's too hard. It's freaking hot out here. And so I ended up wanting to pursue higher education because I didn't want to work in the fields. A lot of the time, if you read my materials, if you read my statement of purpose, if you look at some of the experiences I do have, it all relates to one core theme. And my core theme is rural education. And so the photo up here is actually the town that I used to live in before I moved down here to San Diego, which is called Soap Lake, Washington. It's a rural town that only has 1,500 people. And so going through that education system there, I saw that a lot of my peers, including myself, were deprived of a lot of resources because our town was so small. We couldn't access, let's say, healthcare. We had to drive an hour just to freaking go to a hospital or a clinic. We didn't have AP courses. We didn't have just different courses that are, or different elements of schooling that would get you into competitive programs. And so because of my experiences there, and then if you add the element of race as well, I was one of like 2 people of color in my school. And so I talk a lot about that when I write my statement of purposes, when I look at my resume, the type of work that I do in terms of my extracurriculars, because that's really the line of work that I want to do. So when you're thinking about your application components, you want to stick to a central theme. And I try to stick to the theme of immigration, agriculture, rural education, because that's my experience and that's what I want to do in the future. And so that's what I speak about in these different elements of your graduate school application. The photo down here is actually my family. This is when I graduated in undergrad. I went to Washington State University where I pursued a double degree, one in English with a concentration in teacher preparation. So I got certified to teach in my state. And then I also pursued foreign languages and cultures degree where I was thinking about teaching Spanish as well. And because I thought it would be a good idea for me and it would make me more marketable for me to teach 2 different subjects in high school than one. And so I pursued 2 degrees and I ended up taking over 150 credits at my institution, which it runs on a semester system. And that's something that I spoke about in my graduate school application. So I wanted to show that I was ambitious. I wanted to show that I like to learn, that I actually enjoyed learning. So I spoke about this 150 plus credits that I took, even though my degree only required 120. But at my undergraduate institution, I learned about research because I am first generation, which means that my parents or legal guardians do not have a 4-year degree. I didn't know how to navigate a college system. At least in my first year, I was new to campus. I didn't know what it was like to go to college. None of my family members ever gone to college, so I didn't have that capital to be able to draw from. And so I speak about that as well when I'm like working on different projects, when I am writing these applications, when I write fellowship applications. So I speak about my first generation low income identity that I did use to navigate the US educational system at, in this case, at Washington State University. And so there I learned about research, and there's this program called the McNair Achievement Program, which helps underrepresented students learn about PhD programs, learn about research, and then helps them get into competitive PhD programs. And through that program is where I really learned what a PhD was, what a master's program was, and how that can drive my career interests. And so at the undergraduate level, I conducted 2 research theses. One was actually at the school that I went to, and then the other one was because I won a competitive research fellowship, and I went to the University of Arizona where I conducted research on a different topic that I was interested in. But because of my undergraduate experience and because of this program, I was able to learn about research and PhD applications, master's applications, and so forth. The photo up here is actually my graduation at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And at that school, I was focusing on one topic, which was family engagement, specifically Latino family engagement. And then if you look at it closer, I was really looking at how are Latino fathers involved in their children's education, and then particularly in higher education. So, and the reason why I'm saying like all these like little niches, because that's how you have to think about these applications, especially if you're applying to Harvard, if you're applying to really any Ivy League institution for a master's or PhD program, you want to have that niche, you want to have that theme, and that theme needs to be unique, something that no one else is doing, because you're going to want to stand out. And that's the way that you're going to stand out, is by having this unique theme, this unique niche that you want to draw and you want to focus your whole application on. And so my unique niche was that not a lot of scholars or really people were talking about Latino father involvement in higher education. And still to this day, that's the literature doesn't show, people are not researching this. And so I wanted to become that expert in this niche, right? And so that's what I talked a little bit briefly about in my statement of purpose for the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And my advisor ended up being one of the leading researchers in family engagement. And so what they do in these committees, what they do is they actually read your application, especially if you name them in your statement of purpose. They'll read your application and then they'll decide if you're a good fit for them to mentor you. And so Dr. Karen Mapp, who's the professor at the HGSC, she selected me to obviously gain admission, but also to be my advisor. And so she was able to help me with this topic that I was trying to explore at HGSC, which was Latino father engagement in higher education. And that's also what I wrote my writing sample that maybe some of you might have seen in the YouTube video. That's the class I took her class, and I used that writing sample for PhD programs because it fit my topic, it fit my niche, it fit what I wanted to do in the future. And again, I do want to just remind you that I'm pretty sure that all of us here have a bunch of research interests, right? I do myself. Like I look at family engagement, I look at men of color in higher education, I look at rural education. But for applications, you want to focus on one theme, especially if you're applying for master's programs. If you're applying for, like, let's say competitive PhD programs like the Ivy Leagues, like a Stanford or Harvard, then you want to think more at a larger scale. You want to think about policy, you want to think about changing systems level changes, things along those sorts, because those schools are looking for the next change agents. They're looking for these people that are going to change educational, in this case, educational systems, educational practices at a larger scale, not at a minute scale. But for the master's program, you want to look at it at a smaller scale. Then the next story that I draw from when I write my fellowship applications, my graduate school applications, is my experiences. So after my master's program at Harvard, I was a director of a federally funded program that helps first-generation low-income students and people with disabilities, gain admission to community colleges persist through community college, graduate from community college, and then transfer. And so I help students with a bunch of things like advising, scholarships, transfer applications, financial aid, etc. And I always draw from that experience because a lot of my students were underrepresented and marginalized, and they needed support to get to that next step. And so I talk about this because obviously my main goal in getting a PhD is to transform education, right? Educational systems, educational policies, educational spaces. And the way I go about that is by drawing from my experiences, not only in my work experience, my professional experience, but also research, but also my personal experiences. And so I draw from my students' stories. My students tell me when I used to work, they tell me a bunch of stories about, they were facing these hardships. For example, like I had one student whose father passed away for it was like a quarter, I think, and he had to quit school to figure out his life because his father passed away, and his father was the person that provided for his family, but then he had to become the provider, and so he had to quit school and stuff like that. So I talk about those stories in my statement of purpose instead of just saying, oh, I helped over 400 students persist, graduate, and transfer. Yes, I say that, but I also provide a story behind that. Like, they want to know your stories. They don't want to know facts. Your resume is more factual, where you write, here's what I did in this role. The statement of purpose is to provide life to those facts. And that's what I did. So I drew from these experiences, I drew from these stories of my students in terms of how I want to transform education and why I want to transform education for my specific niche. So yeah, so that's my story. And what I want you to do when you're thinking about brainstorming or editing your statement of purposes in particular, you want to maybe like draw from some of your pictures. Look at photo albums, look at photos, and try to see if you can tell a story with each photo briefly, and then you should draw from that in terms of writing your materials. All right, so let's go ahead and dive right into the grad school application components. And we're gonna go over a few of them. So we're gonna go over the online application form, so the actual demographic information and so forth that you have to type in when you're applying. We're gonna go over letters of recommendation, resume, CV, standardized test scores, in this case, the GRE, the general test. We're gonna go over writing sample and what to include there. Then we're gonna touch base on statement of purpose. Okay, so the online application form, the first thing that you should be doing already is registering for an account and reviewing the entire application as soon as possible. And the reason why you should be doing this is because some applications might ask for some random thing that you would have never thought they might ask. And I'll share some examples in a little bit once I go through these 3 points here. But so you want to review the application first as a whole and see what they're asking of you, that way you're able to strategize in terms of what to include. Maybe you're just like, I don't even know what to include in this section, and you want to ask for advice from others. And so the way that you go about learning about these different components is by you reviewing the whole application and then strategizing to be able to tackle that certain component. You also want to try to fill out as much of the application as possible. Try not to leave anything blank, but also a caveat with this is don't make stuff up. If you can't answer a certain section, then leave it blank. But try your best to fill out as much as possible. And the reason why is because most master's programs and some PhD programs, they don't offer an interview portion of their process. And so these documents here is your interview. So think about it in that sense. These documents are your interview. So you want to provide as much information as possible to the committee without that interview, without you meeting them on Zoom or in person. So think about your whole application as your interview, and the way that you go about sharing a lot of aspects of your life is by filling out as much as possible on the application. And so I want you to do that when you are thinking about filling it out. So in this section, they're mostly going to be asking you demographic information, so like your name, your email address, how can they contact you, etc. They're going to ask you for self-reported GRE scores. Again, don't lie, because they will ask you to submit a report of the actual GRE scores from ETS. And so self-report them as you see them on ETS. They're going to ask you about your educational background, so where you went to school in terms of your undergraduate, master's programs, and some programs do ask you for your high school information as well. They're going to ask you for employment information. It's going to be separate from your resume or CV. So they're going to ask you, they might give you a bunch of different slots for it. They might only give you 3 or 4 slots for employment. They're going to ask you, they might ask you for extracurricular activities or any volunteer involvement. Again, they might ask you for 3 to 4 examples of these involvements, especially if you have like a list of them on your resume or CV. Choose the ones that are most prominent, that you've had the most impact in, and you're going to write those in the online application form. They're going to ask you to fill out recommendation information. Who are you going to ask for letters of recommendation? And if you haven't started that process yet, I suggest that you start as soon as possible, because most applications are due in December. Some could be due in November, some are due in January. So you want to make sure your letter of rec writers have enough time to be able to provide you with a strong letter. And then they also might ask you to add any additional information that you may want them to know about, right? So we'll go over what I put in my Harvard Grad School of Education portion of that section. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to kind of share with you what I wrote in some of these sections. So obviously my demographic information I'm not going to share just because it's personal. So we're going to skip that part. But let's see. So if you are applying to like Harvard Grad School of Education, they're going to ask you academic information. So they're going to ask you, do you think that grades are a true measure of your ability? And I put no. They're going to ask you, have you ever withdrawn or repeated a term in any college or university? They're going to ask you if there has ever been interruptions in your course of study. And the reason why I wanted to mention this is because one of you had asked me in the questions on the Google form, how do I go about stating, like, let's say I had a challenge throughout a quarter and that's why my GPA is low. So this is the opportunity for you to do that. They're literally asking you, was there any interruptions? And you're going to write a small little brief paragraph explaining that interruption and how it affected your grade in terms of what term you ended up getting a low GPA, or maybe overall why you got a low GPA, or maybe you weren't able to get research experience. For example, you can say like, I had to work 40 hours a week because of whatever reason. So this is your opportunity to answer that question and to provide insight. And I would say that your statement of purpose should be more focused on your reasons for attending grad school than telling them like, here's why I got a low GPA. Don't waste that time on there. Put that information in other elements of the application, in this case, in that section there. So let's go ahead and I'm going to read you what I wrote in terms of why I don't think that grades measure my intellectual ability. All right. So I had put, so the question was, do you believe your grades are a true measure of your academic ability? And so here's what I wrote. I do not believe my grades are a true measure of my academic ability. Although I possess a 3.49 out of 4.0 grade point average, I believe that this does not showcase my practical experience in the field of education or the knowledge I have gained while pursuing my degrees in English and Spanish. As noted in my transcript, I will have completed over 150 credits, which shows my aptitude and ambition to learn to become a strong candidate for graduate school. The courses I have taken are both practical and theoretical. My preparation to become a certified teacher in the state of Washington is not reflected by my grades. I believe my practical experience and ambition to learn are a true measure of my academic ability. So I kind of explained, even though I think my GPA was not that bad, right? But at the time I was like, a 3.49 GPA is not going to get me to a school like Harvard, right? I had like this mindset that I had to have a 4.0 or a 3.9 and have these amazing GRE scores, right? Which I didn't have any of that. And so I thought that my GPA was mediocre. And so I wanted to explain, okay, here's why I don't think my GPA, shows my academic ability. Here are the reasons why I do think that I show promise in terms of being a strong candidate for your program or for grad school, etc. I think in retrospect, I could have added a little bit more to kind of build my case, but honestly, it didn't even matter because I got in. But I think in terms of like, if I wanted to reframe it or add other elements, I would have mentioned things like, how I'm a strong writer, because in graduate school, you're going to be writing a lot, reading a lot. And so I knew that my GRE scores didn't portray my intellectual ability in terms of my analytical skills and my comprehension skills. I got really low scores. So I could have said something like, oh, I published two research articles in these journals. And that shows that I'm able to write critically and think critically of the content. Or I could have said something like, oh, I got this distinction in writing from my school, which I am in the top 10% of junior class. So I could have wrote that as well, but just to make my case a little bit stronger, but obviously it didn't even matter because I still got in. And so in the other two sections though, I didn't write anything, and I do give you the space to, and I'll show you here, and they do give you the space to explain your situations. And I left mine blank just because I didn't have anything to write in terms of why I withdrawn from school, or if I had to transfer universities, etc. Okay, let's see what else. Okay, so the next thing is when they ask you about your employment, if you are an undergraduate student, or even if you're not, if you're already a professional, you can also write like your undergraduate jobs in the employment section. Don't think that the employment section is only for professional experience, full-time professional experience. What I did was, because I applied to HGSE right out of undergrad, I chose to write out all of my undergraduate jobs. So I wrote that I was an English tutor for this organization called the College Assistance Migrant Program. I wrote that I was a student ambassador for the university and I worked for admissions office. I also wrote that I was an assistant teacher for the Writing Center at my institution. And all those were part-time jobs. I think I worked like 10 hours a week or something along those lines. So they weren't full-time. So don't think that employment experience only means full-time work. Then they also provided a little section on extracurricular volunteer activities. And I'm going to show you here, and you can tell that I wrote a lot. I was very detailed in terms of my experiences. So I want you to be that detailed as well. And so what I did was I mentioned things like I was the vice president of the student ambassador program. Then I wrote my roles. And so an example of my roles was that I was I provided insight to enhance the college experience for prospective and current students at Washington State University, and I designed and sponsored events for students in different demographics. I also wrote a lot about my undergraduate research experience. So I wrote about the summer research institute at the University of Arizona that I was able to be a part of. I also wrote about my McNair research as well, and then I wrote down who my advisors were, what was the title of my research, and how I developed the research. Then I also wrote about my summer day camp counselor experience when I went to Japan, and I designed and organized and facilitated this youth camp for children on military bases. So I wrote that as part of my experiences. And for HGSE here, they only allow you 4 things. And if you've seen my YouTube video on my resume and CV, I have like a 5-page document. So I chose the 4 things that I thought were representative of who I am. And so I wanted to show my leadership skills with the vice president stuff. I wanted to show my research skills with the research experiences. And then I wanted to show how I was able to design different programming for, educational spaces with my summer camp experience. Let's see. Okay, so there's this other section on the application that that is about additional information. And so in this section, it asks you, why are you applying to HGSE? And it's going to give you like a drop down menu that is going to allow you to click on different things, right? And so I put that I wanted to apply to HGSE because I spoke to an alumni. And so I had put 2 people on here. So I put this guy named Jonathan Wall, who I don't know if you all know this, but HGSE in particular, they have a program where they'll pair you up with a current student, and that current student's gonna able to answer your questions about the application, about their student life, etc. So I was part of that. I requested a mentor through that program, and so it was Jonathan Wall, and he was able to provide me with examples of a statement of purpose, able to provide me with just insight on his experience, etc. And then I also wrote about, or I briefly wrote about this other person that I knew who was actually a former student at my undergraduate institution who's also in the McNair program. And so I knew her, and I wrote her name in here. So I think it does hold weight if you have connections to HGSC, but also if you're making the attempt to get to know the campus or get to know the program, get to know the people in the program. And so if you do have that experience, definitely write that down in this additional information section. All right, let's move on because we're already 40 minutes in and I have a lot more to talk about. Okay, so letters of recommendation. So usually they're gonna want you to submit 3 letters of recommendation. Some programs might give you the option of up to 5. So Stanford is an example of that. So you want to know, what do the programs you're applying to value? And that's how you're going to select the people that should write letters of recommendation. So for example, you can find this information on their website. So if your program values practical experience, then you want to make sure that you ask a employer to talk about your practical experience. If your program values research, then you want to ask professors with a PhD or research mentors to write you letters of recommendation. If your program values community involvement or teaching experience, then you want to find someone who's able to speak about those experiences. And you find that information on the website. So for example, for my PhD program now, the title of my program is Transforming Lives, or what is it called? Transforming Education in a Diverse Society. And on their website, it strictly states, we want to accept people who have experience in the field, whether it's practical from professional experience, whether it's volunteer, whether it's involvement, but we want to accept people who have that experience in education or teaching someone or anything. And so because of that reason, I chose to submit 1 letter of recommendation from my employer at that time. If your program is strictly research theoretical based, then I suggest that you only ask professors with a PhD, research mentors. Don't ask any employers. So in the next point here, usually for PhD programs, because this is a theoretical, degree, you want to provide evidence that you are able to think critically, that you're able to produce, research that is going to impact your field or the community, etc. So if you're applying for PhD programs, you should be asking professors with a PhD, and I emphasize this, with the PhD, because if you're an undergraduate student, for example, some of your first or second year professors, they might be current master's students or PhD students who are teaching the course. And so I wouldn't suggest that you ask those people to write letters of recommendation because as sadly as it sounds, they don't really hold weight. What committees want is people in the field, right, who already conduct the research, who know what it's like to have a PhD, who's gone through the PhD process, and who's able to vouch for you that you're going to be able to get through a PhD. And so you want to ask people, professors with PhDs or faculty with PhDs, even if they're not professors, they don't teach, if they're like admin or staff who have PhDs, that's who you want to ask. You also want to ask research advisors or mentors. And then a caveat, sometimes employers, and that's the reason why I say that is because in my case, my PhD program emphasized practical experience. And so I asked an employer to write me a letter of rec. For master's programs, you want to ask professors, it can be anybody, extracurricular or volunteer advisors, employers, mentors, research advisors, and etc. These are like the most common ones that I've seen, but most master's programs, especially in education, they call them terminal masters, which means that you are there to gain a certain skill set that you want to apply in a practical field. HGSC is one of those programs. And so in that sense, you want to show that you have, experience working in the field. You want to show that you also can conduct research, that you are able to, read critically, think critically, write critically. And so a master's program is more flexible. Some master's programs are very theoretical based. And the way that you figure this out is if you're writing a master's thesis, that's a theoretical based master's. And then so in that sense, you want to make sure you are asking people that can vouch for your research skills, your analytical skills, et cetera, which I would focus more on professors and research mentors. When you are asking your potential letter of rec writers for letters of rec, you want to provide them with a packet. This packet should include a statement of purpose draft, your resume and CV, a list of programs with the deadlines, And then you can also include links to your, let's say if you have an online portfolio, let's say you're applying for, I don't know, a music degree, and then you want to showcase that you are able to play violin really well. I don't know. You can send them a link to a video of you performing somewhere, right? So you can provide whatever you need for them to write you a strong letter. You also want to provide them with a description of why you selected them to write you a letter. So pretty much you're kind of writing a mini letter rec, and you want to include here things like, you know, let's say you're choosing an employer, right? So I would write something like, I don't know, thank you for, dear Dr. blah, blah, blah. I am writing to ask if you can write me a letter of recommendation for graduate school. I'm applying to these programs in this field. Um, I wanted to ask you to write me a letter of recommendation because of our experience working together on leading this campaign at our university. If you recall, we did this, and this. So tell them the steps that you did, to get to run that campaign, right? So you met with different stakeholders. You raised money for fun. You raised money as funding. You recruited people. You ran a team. You managed people. Blah blah blah. Whatever it was, you want to tell the person that you're asking for a letter of rec, here's what we did, and here's what I want you to focus on in that letter, or at least highlight. Don't forget to highlight this. It's important for me to showcase this side of myself. So if you're thinking about leadership skills that you want to highlight, like tell them specifically, just because they might forget, or they might just gloss over it, or they're getting a lot of people who are asking for letters of rec, and they're just going to give you like a generic letter, and so, or they're going to base it off of your statement of purpose or resume, and maybe you're just like, you know what, I don't want them to focus on those aspects of my application. I want them to focus on something different. And so you want to tell them, here's what you should highlight in this letter, and be detailed about it. Don't be afraid to be detailed. Don't think that it's too forward, but also ask it in a nice way. Don't be demanding either. You want to make sure that they highlight what you think is important for them to highlight, and then they'll talk about any other aspect that they feel is a good representation of who you are. But that's a tip that I have for you all there. Let's see what time it is. Okay. All right. So I'm going to go back to the letter of recommendation, and I'm actually going to give you an example. I have the letter of rec from one of my HGSC people here. Okay, so this one was from my research mentor. So I'm going to read you like a little snippet of what he wrote that I had asked him to emphasize. So let's see. Okay, so again, I was an undergraduate student at Washington State University in the state of Washington, and I did the summer internship for research at the University of Arizona. So obviously I had to travel over there, right? So prior to me attending this program, my mentor asked me to do something. So he asked me to read a bunch of books and literature on the topic that we were going to read, that we were going to focus on that summer. And so he wrote here, prior to arriving at the UA, University of Arizona, Mr. Valdovinos was already vigorously reading the existent literature on the subject, and this allowed him to hit the ground running when he arrived on campus. This stands in the stark contrast to experiences of many of my colleagues who also mentor summer students, where getting them to a pre-program preparation is next to impossible. Mr. Valdovinos truly wanted to produce the best research product possible, and he was willing to do whatever that required, even in the short amount of time in a summer program. So in this little example here, it kind of shows again, my passion for education issues, but also that I liked learning, and when you're at the graduate level, you want to learn. That's why you're going, right? And so this little snippet here is showing the community like that I'm really interested and passionate about this subject. And obviously there's more content to it that I'm not sharing, but because of my passion for this topic, and because I wanted to produce this great summer research project that I read a bunch of literature prior to me going to the program. And so Dr. Cabrera wrote about this in my letter of recommendation that I asked them to be to emphasize that part because I did a lot of work prior to me even starting the program, which started in June. I did the work in May. And so yeah, so if I didn't tell him to write that in there, I don't know if he would have. But yeah, so that's kind of a little example of why I think it's important for you to tell your letter of rec writer what to write. All right, so resume and CV. So the first tip that I have for you for your resume or CV is formatting and organization do matter, because these committee members are, looking through a bunch of like hundreds of applications sometimes. They're not going to be able to read every little aspect of your resume or CV, especially if your resume or CV is long, right? Mine was 5 pages. That's one that I submitted to HGSC. And so I already knew coming in that they weren't going to read every single line, every single point on my resume or CV. And so the way that I went about formatting my resume or CV was by, bolding things, underlining different subheadings, and so forth. And then I was able, and then, so here's the next point here. So you want it to read cleanly and easy to read. So someone could skim it and then they're going to be able to read further in depth different aspects of your resume or CV. And they have to be able to do this by just skimming through it. So let's just say, so the next point here is, or the next couple of points here is you want to write unique subheadings. And the examples that I have on this PowerPoint here are such as student success and advocacy experience, or pedagogical training, or scholarly presentations. And these are unique subheadings because honestly, I don't see these, and most people go the generic route or the generic route. They write things like, I don't know, teaching experience or extracurricular involvement or work experience or publications. These are things that are standard. You can expect everybody to write this. And then when you're reading a bunch of these applications, it gets boring. I used to read resumes for when I was hiring people for my previous job. And honestly, it gets boring. Like I just like skipped it. I was like, you know what, like this is like, I'm bored, like nothing really catches my attention. So my tip is for you to write these unique subheadings. That way you're able to catch these committee members' attention and they're gonna be wanting to read what's under that. So for example, like student success and advocacy experience. That's telling me as a reader, if I just skim through it, it's telling me a lot. It's telling me what I can expect to see in that section. Even if that person has like 2 to 3 pages on this section, I already know what to expect. I can tell that the student is, or this applicant cares about student success. They care about advocating for people. And so if I wanted to learn more about their advocacy work, I would read more, some of their things that are under there. If you would have just put, instead of that, if you would just put extracurricular involvement, to me, that's just like, okay, cool. Maybe they played in intramural sports and that's not relevant to grad school. So I want you to think about your subheadings and think about unique ways in which you can change those. So maybe instead of work experience, you wanted to put, I want to highlight my experience in higher education. So I'm going to change my subheading to higher education experience. So that's telling the committee, in this section, you should expect to read only higher education experience. Let's say you have, I think international experience is actually a good unique subheading. Let's say you have international research experience, and I want you to write that, international research experience. That's going to give a signal to the committee that in this section, you're going to focus on international research. And so I want you to think about it in that sense. It's especially if you want to become a professor and you're writing about becoming a professor in your statement of purpose, you can write something like pedagogical training. So if you went to a workshop, if you attended a conference, etc., you can write things in that section telling the committee, okay, this person wrote that they wanted to become a professor in their statement of purpose, and now they're backing it up with practical experience, trainings in their resume. And so now I can see what type of pedagogy they might consist, or their teaching might consist of, and so forth. And so they might want to read like, okay, so they're definitely equity focused because they went to this equity training, or they had this equity training, blah, 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 right? So you want to make sure you write these unique subheadings for your resume and CV to stand out. So here's a pro tip in terms of if you're like, I don't even know what I can write with subheadings or what a strong resume or CV looks like. My pro tip is that I want you to go look at your program or other programs' web pages. On these web pages, sometimes they do provide information on current students and past students, and they also display the student or faculty CVs. So I want you to go into these CVs and see what type of headings they're using and adopt something similar to yours. That's the way that I molded my resume and CV when I was applying for grad school, and the way that I still go about, restructuring my resume or CV. I'm looking at what my field values and what faculty members who already have a PhD, who already have a great track record in academia, what are they emphasizing in their CVs, and what can I apply in mine? And even moving forward, like these resumes and CVs that you see on these websites, they are telling, right? If you want to become a professor, you're going to notice themes. You're going to notice that they're always talking about publications, book reviews. They're talking about, let's see, research, obviously. And so you want to start thinking about how can I go about being involved in research, publishing articles? How can I go about writing op-eds? How can I go about being on a journal review committees and so forth? So I want you to go and look at these CVs that are on websites that are free, that are out there for anybody to access, and use that to mold your resume or CV. The next thing that I want to say is stop using Word templates for your resume or CV. First of all, they're frustrating in terms of if you want someone to edit them for you or give you some feedback. And then also in my opinion, they're not professional. So I want you to look at what the standard looks like in terms, again, with the pro tip, look at what faculty CVs look like in your field and make your own and, emulate what that CV or resume looks like in your field and do the same thing in yours. And then another common thing that I see when I am looking at resumes or CVs is a lack of detail. So be detailed in your explanation of your experiences and follow typical conventions in your field. And this mostly goes with when you're writing, let's say you have a publication. You want to write the publication in terms of what your field values. So if your field values APA format, MLA format, Chicago style, whatever it is, that's how you want to write your resume or CV in that structure, because again, you're getting evaluated based on these documents. So if you are citing, or if you're writing your publications in MLA format and your field values APA, then that's telling of the person, right? Like, okay, this person's not writing an APA. Maybe they don't know nothing about education, or maybe they don't know about anything about my field. So think about it in those aspects too. And then again, the detail part, be very detailed. Again, this is your interview initially. So you don't want to leave anything to assumptions. You don't want them to assume like, oh, I know your experience being a first generation college student because I'm also a first generation college student. First generation college students have different experiences, and that's dependent on context, on different factors, right? So you don't want them to assume like that they already know what first generation college students face in terms of challenges. You want to strictly state, I am a first generation college student, and here's my experience. Don't leave it up to assumption. And that's what I see a lot when I'm reviewing resumes or CVs. People assume that I know what management looks like, right? Management looks differently in different spaces. So you want to state exactly what that management experience looks like in your context. So be detailed. All right, so standardized testing. So for most PhD programs and master's programs, they usually ask you for the GRE. Sometimes it's optional, and obviously because of the pandemic, some schools have not been asking for a GRE. And I do have a video on that in terms of should you take it and submit it. And I'm not going to go over it here just because I am running out of time here. But go watch that video, and that gives you some insight on like what are my opinions on that. But just a brief overview on standardized testing. So like I get a question a lot about what's a good score. And the way that you go about figuring out what's a good score is you want to go and review your program average scores of their admitted students and try to aim for that range. Some programs, not all though, some do offer this range. I know the University of Texas education program, they actually not even education, for like all of their graduate programs, they provide you mean scores for every aspect of the GRE, etc. And so I would suggest that if you're just like, what score should I aim for? Go look at different programs and see what is their mean score. I feel like their mean score, the ones that I've seen, are usually about the range of like 156, around that. Obviously, if you're applying for like the Ivy League or the Stanfords or these really competitive programs, you want to aim for higher. But again, you don't need to score high or meet the average scores to get into the program. Like I mentioned, my GRE scores were really low. I couldn't even share my GRE score. So when I applied to HGSE, I scored a 144, which is the 22nd percentile in verbal. In the quant, I scored a 143, which is 15th percentile. And then in the analytical section, I scored a 4, which is the 56th percentile. So as you can tell, my averages were not even close to what HGSE projects on their website. And so if you do score low and you're scared about that, don't stress about it. Honestly, a GRE score is not going to get you into a program alone. It's the whole application. And for me in particular, I think the most important aspects are the statement of purpose, the letters of recommendation, and your experiences, your resume and CV. And those, I think, are the key components to getting you into a program. And so don't take the GRE multiple times. It's not going to get you into a program just by you scoring a perfect score. So I suggest that you do not stress about it, focus on other aspects of the application and make those stronger versus trying to get the perfect score on this GRE. The GRE test has 3 components. So the verbal reasoning, quantitative reasoning, and analytical writing. And the way that you go about, let's say, showcasing that you are strong in these areas without getting a high score in the GRE are a couple of ways. So the verbal reasoning, in this section, they're really testing you on your, comprehension skills, your critical thinking skills, and things on that nature, right? Because in grad school, again, you are reading and writing a lot. And so they want to know that you're able to understand the content that you're reading and you're able to, look for themes, look for gaps in the research, and then write critically about these topics. And so some ways that you can go about showcasing that you are great at verbal reasoning aside from the GRE is by showcasing critical thinking skills via your SOP writing, right? So there's going to be a section on your statement of purpose where you're going to be writing about your potential dissertation. In that section, if you're applying for a PhD, you're going to want to write, here's how I'm thinking about the literature, here's what the literature says, here's how I'm concisely talking about the literature, because in the SOP, you only have a limited space. You're not going to write a whole thesis, right? And so you're going to write, here's what the literature says in a sentence or two, and here's what I think I need to do to fill some gaps or progress in the field in terms of this topic. And that's how you're going to show your critical thinking skills via your SOP. Another way that you can go about showing your skill sets and verbal reasoning is by your writing sample. So most PhD programs are going to ask you for a writing sample. And that's a great way for you to show how you think about different literature, how you condense literature, how you look at different arguments within literature, and your response within that literature. So think about projecting a strong score in your verbal reasoning via your writing sample. You can also show this in your research experience, right? In your research experience, you're going to be reading literature. Again, I'm emphasizing literature here because that's a big part of graduate school, reading the literature. And so I want you to show this and talk about this in your different documents, in your resume or CV, in your statement of purpose, etc. You also can show this by your courses, right? So if you're taking English courses, if you are an English major like I was, I wanted to showcase, okay, here's all my background in English. I know these concepts. I know these fancy terms. I know this, and this. And I can show evidence about this through my grades. And so these are just some examples in terms of how you can showcase or how you can offset a low verbal score and other aspects of your application. For the quant reasoning, you can show improvement or knowledge of math with math courses, right? So if you did strongly in your math courses or your engineering courses or your STEM courses, that's a great way to show, to offset a low quant score. You can also showcase this by your mixed methods research or your quantitative research methods in your research experience, or maybe you took a course on mixed methods or quant methods, whatever it is. You can showcase that you are strong in this area with a low GRE score. You can also showcase this by pursuing a minor in a STEM field or any quantitative reasoning field. And you can show that by obviously getting good grades and maybe getting a letter of recommendation from a professor in that space. For the analytical writing, you can showcase your analytical skill sets with your SOP, your writing sample, your thesis, etc. All right, I'm gonna look at the chat if there's any questions here. Okay, just comments then, cool. All right, let's move on. Okay, so the next topic that I wanted to cover is the statement of purpose. And I like to emphasize this a lot. Obviously, if you've seen my YouTube videos, I talk a lot about statement of purpose because it is crucial. And I think a lot of students have that's the hardest thing about the application, in my opinion. Because all of us are very diverse in experiences, very diverse in backgrounds. And sometimes we want to tell our whole life story in 3 pages, right? And that's literally impossible. And so I wanted to first start off by just telling you all the difference between a statement of purpose and a personal statement. And the reason why I wanted to start off with this is because whenever I review statement of purposes for all of you, I see a lot of personal statement and I don't see a lot of statement of purpose. So a lot of my comments are always about, stop telling your whole life story, condense that to a sentence or two, and so forth. So I wanted to just kind of tell you all the differences. So a statement of purpose, and this is what all graduate programs are asking you. They're asking you to tell them what you want to do in terms of career goal, research, etc. What is your future goal? Why is graduate education important for you to attain that goal that you have, whatever it is? They also want you to tell them what resources, what parts of the program are going to help you reach those goals. So this could be professors, especially for the PhD. You want to have 1 to 3 professors that match your research interests, because for the PhD, you are going to have to write a dissertation, this long freaking thesis on a topic, and you need a mentor in that field that's going to help you get to that large product. So you want to talk about 1 to 3 people that could potentially mentor you, that have the expertise that you need to reach that milestone, to get your PhD. Then you also want to explain, how are you a good match for this program based on your experiences, based on your research topic, based on whatever criteria you have. And you also want to tell them how you're a good match, but also how they're a good match for you. Then you also want to emphasize your accomplishments and, again, research interests. And when you talk about these pieces, don't put them factually. Don't restate your resume or CV. They don't want that. They want to know the stories behind that, right? We'll go over that a little bit in the next couple of slides here. A personal statement. Some programs do ask you for an optional, most of the time, personal statement. So if they do ask you for this, what they're asking you to provide to them is your story, who you are, your identities, how those identities, those experiences, how have those molded your aptitude, your pursuit of graduate study. So the personal statement is a story. The statement of purpose, like the title says, is your purpose for going to grad school. So in the personal statement, you could be creative with a compelling story. You can address weaknesses in your application or challenges or barriers you've overcome. You can focus on personal motivations, etc. So think about a personal statement as your life story, but that has that theme of why I want to go to grad school, whereas your statement of purpose is your aptitude, your reasonings for the program you're applying to and how that program could help you. All right, so here's a basic outline of what, and 3 components that I think your statement of purpose must have. And if your statement of purpose does not have this right now, you want to definitely include it. So the first one is introducing yourself, your interests and motivations. So you want to ask yourself, what are your academic and professional goals? What key experiences have contributed to your commitment in the field and desire to pursue graduate school? So when you're speaking about your background, again, they don't want to know your life story. You want to condense that to no more than 1 paragraph, no more than 4 sentences describing your background. And your background should be focused on your overall theme of your statement of purpose. I see a lot of time that people write random identities that don't really relate to your topic. So for example, someone recently, I read this statement of purpose where someone was applying to an education program and they were talking about something that wasn't even education related. And I think their thought process was that they wanted just to like tell the reader, here's one of my identities that doesn't really match education, but I still want to tell you. So I'm going to tell you. And that's not a good strategy, because yes, they care about all your identities. Again, we all have different identities that have molded who we are. But for the purpose of the statement of purpose, you want to stick to 1 core theme, your niche, your theme, and use your identities that fit within that theme to speak about in your statement of purpose. Another error, I guess if you want to call it, that I see in statement of purposes in terms of your academic and professional goals is that the student, the applicant, is not specific enough, right? So if you want to become a professor, okay, like tell me more. Don't just say like the reason, or I am pursuing a PhD in education because I want to become a researcher and professor. All right, cool. I want to know more though. What type of professor? Do you want to focus on this type of research? Do you want to focus on blah, blah, blah? As a professor, do you want to mentor, marginalized groups? Do you want to blah, blah, blah? Like, tell me more about that profession. And this has to be brief again. Like all these things have to be brief, like 1 or 2 sentences. Tell me more. Do you want to work at a tier 1 research institution? Do you want to work at a private school? Do you want to work, I don't know, at a community college? Do you want to conduct research on, hold on. Do you want to conduct research in a certain niche? Do you want to work in an urban setting? Do you want to work in a rural setting? Like, where do you want to work? Where do you want to be a professor at? That's what I want you to, what's it called? That's how specific I want you to be. Let's see. Okay. The next part that you should definitely have in your statement of purpose is you want to summarize your undergraduate career or your master's experience, whatever it is, the academic portion of it, right? So you want to speak about your research. You want to speak about, in my case, I spoke about my McNair research, my summer research opportunities. If you are in honors college or you were in honors college, speak about that. If you did like just like another program, or maybe you did like a independent study or a self-directed experience, talk about that. If you're applying for the PhD in particular or a theoretical master's program, research experience is key. And if you don't have like what's it called, formal experience for research, what you could do is you can talk about how maybe in a course you were able to apply some of the research processes and speak about that in your what's it called, in this section here. So yeah, so here, let's talk about other courses, majors, extracurriculars that have prepared you for grad school. When I mention extracurriculars, I'm not talking about being a senator for the student government. I'm not talking about that because unless your PhD or master's program is in like political science or some type of law research or something along those niches, then you could talk about it, right? You could say like, during my experience as a senator, blah, 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 we didn't use research informed practices to inform our university policies that we were implementing, whatever it is, right? So you want to make those connections, right? And if you cannot do that by the extracurricular you're talking about, take it out. And this applies to anything actually, even your courses, your major. Like if it does not apply to your niche, if it does not apply to your topic, your program, take it out. The last part here is you want to elaborate on your academic interest. So what do you hope to research as a graduate student? At the PhD level, again, you are going to submit a dissertation. So they want to know, okay, what type of topics are you interested in? And tell me more about that, right? Where do you see the gaps? Have you conducted research in that topic before? If not, what interested you in that topic, or what shifted your field or your subfield, whatever it is? And then you want to be detailed here, right? You want to maybe give them an example of what this dissertation might look like. So your topic, your questions, your theoretical frameworks, your methodology, the imposed implications, the outcomes. What do you hope this research study, what do you hope that it does once it's completed, etc. You want to mention all these elements in that part of your application because it shows a little bit, it shows a couple of things. So first, it shows that you know the research process, right? It also shows that you've been thinking critically about your topic, and it shows interest. It shows that you are, ingrained in this field, that you know what you want to do, and this is going to change, right? As a graduate student, you're going to be taking coursework for at least 2 years if you're doing a PhD. And so they understand that your academic interests might change, but it gives them an idea of how you're thinking about the research process. Then you also want to tell them how this program and institution is going to prepare you to meet your personal and professional goals, and obviously your research goals as well. And so you're going to mention things like your college or your university is the only university with this lab, this focus, right? So for example, like at the University of Texas at Austin, they have this research institute called Project Males, and I forget what the males stand for. It's an acronym, but pretty much they do research on boys and men of color and U.S. educational experiences. And that's the topic that I'm interested in. And so if I was applying to that program, which I did apply, I would mention like I want to become, or I want to work alongside the Project Males staff, and I want to become a researcher to get on research projects with you, such as this project. I also want to be involved in your mentoring program that you offer because I want to mentor boys of color in your mentoring program, and because that fits with my professional research and personal goals. So you want to make these connections. So you want to state and name drop the resource and why that resource meets your personal, professional, and research goals. Okay, so I'm gonna skip some. I already went through some of these points here, but I'm just gonna skim through these just because it's almost noon and I want to get to Q&A and stuff like that. But I guess like the biggest emphasis that I want to say for the introduction is storytelling. Show your passions rather than state them directly. So tell us the story behind the thing that you're writing. You also want to ask yourself, for every aspect of your statement of purpose, you want to ask yourself, why am I telling the committee this? Why is this story, why is this sentence, why is this statement important to my overall mission for grad school? So think about that when you're writing your statement of purpose. Like, why am I including this? And if you can't answer that question, then that means that you should delete that, because there's no passion behind it, there's no explanation, there's no you haven't thought about it critically enough to be able to include it. Let's see, I already mentioned some of these. Okay, so just to close out the statement of purpose, the outline here, I wanted to just speak a little bit about why this program, why this institution question, because you're gonna have to answer it for every program you apply to. And again, I want you to be detailed, name drop. Because whenever I read statement of purposes, it amazes me that students do not like write exactly what they're talking about. They just say something like, oh, I'm interested in your courses. Which courses? They want to know which courses that align with your career interests, in your research interests. So for example, like I gave the HGSC example down here. So I wrote things like, the cohort-based model is what interested me. The Ask With forums, J-term, the president and residence aspect of the higher education master's program. Courses, maybe you're interested in certain methodology courses, maybe you're interested in ethnography, maybe you're interested in case study, maybe you're interested in mixed methods, maybe you're interested in some novel methodology that only a professor at that school does and they teach. Maybe you're interested in practical experience, practical teaching courses, theoretical based courses. Name drop these things because that's going to show them that you are interested in the program because you researched it. Like for example, the president and residence, that's something that you don't just see all over HGSC website. It takes a lot of digging into these websites where you get these things, like I remember in my application and my statement of purpose, I wrote about a project that it wasn't even HGSC, it was a different grad school that they were conducting that related to parent involvement. And I mentioned that in my statement of purpose because I wanted the community to know that I was researching in depth every little aspect of the program, and that's showing my commitment to my topic, but also my passion and interest in their program, right? So I wrote about like this project on it was parental involvement, so parenting styles, and how this professor at, I think it's the Kennedy School, he actually did interviews with, I think it was like first generation low income Harvard undergraduate students in terms of their parents' parenting styles. So he wanted to know like what were the parenting styles of students from who got into elite schools. And so that was interesting to me because it gave me a different perspective on family engagement. That was my topic for HGSC. And I found that through my research of not only HGSC, but every aspect of Harvard. So I want you to go into that detail when you're writing your statement of purposes. Okay, let me look at the chat. Okay, so I see. Okay, so I see a question about what about GRE optional, and thank you for the, okay. So I do have a video about this where I talk about like if you should submit, when you should submit a GRE score and when you should not. And I didn't go over it in this webinar just because there's a lot that goes into it and a lot of it is my opinion. So I would suggest that you maybe look or ask other people for their opinions. But honestly, for me, if your GRE scores are not, I would say if they're not strong, if they don't show a strong side of your intellectual abilities or your research abilities or whatever it is, then I wouldn't submit it. Yeah, I wouldn't submit it if they don't show that case. But I would suggest that you go watch the video because I have more information about it and when you should submit and when you should not submit. How do I show my writing skills without a published publication? So the way that you go about shorting your writing skills is through your statement of purpose. So you want to make sure, because every graduate school program is going to ask you for a statement of purpose. So you want to make sure that you are able to organize it in a way that is telling your story, your journey throughout, your journey to graduate school and why you want to go to graduate school. You also want to show things like your critical thinking skills in terms of how you approach different projects, how you approach your line of work, whatever it is. So that's one way you can show your writing skills. You can also show your writing skills through a writing sample if they ask that. And if you are strong in writing, you can show your writing skills through the analytical portion of the GRE as well. So I would say if you got a 4, that's a good indication that you'll do well in graduate school. 4 or higher. How should you approach your SOP if you have limited research experience? I only wrote 140-page research thesis for my project undergrad. How can I best follow it? Okay, yeah, so you don't need research experience to get into a graduate program. So for example, like in education, specifically my field, a lot of the people in my program, the colleagues in my program are teachers. So when they were in undergrad, they weren't never thinking about getting a PhD. And so a lot of their experience is practical. So the way you go about showing your research skills are in a couple of ways. So like I mentioned earlier, you could talk about your class projects, right? In undergrad, in particular, even master's programs, you always do research papers, right? It's like your final or your midterm. And so the way that you go about that is you show elements on how you thought about your project. So the topic, the question, how you went about answering that question. So your critical thinking skills, how you went about reading the literature, what you thought about the literature, and so forth. And you wrote in here that you did have a 40-page research thesis. I think that's enough. That's enough already. Even just that experience, you can talk about in your statement of purpose. And again, you can frame it in the sense that you talk about your topic, your research questions, your methodology, your theoretical frameworks, the way that you went about analyzing your data, how you collected your data, what the implications are for that work, etc. Is there a place for my story and motivation in SOP? No, in my opinion, no. And the reason why is because so if you think about some applications, they're going to ask you to submit 2 pages. In those 2 pages, you do not have enough room to tell your story. And they don't really care about your story. And that's kind of sounding a little bit brutal here, but like, that's the honest truth. They don't care about your story. They care more about your aptitude and motivation for graduate school. That's the purpose of a statement of purpose. Again, like I mentioned earlier, there's other aspects of the application where you can talk about your story, right? And you could mention, this is the caveat here, you could mention part of your story in your statement of purpose and weave some elements throughout. But it should not be the sole focus of the statement of purpose. So for example, what I mean in terms of weaving your story within your statement of purpose, I mean things like, let's say you're a first generation college student, that's one of your identities, right? So you can say like, in my first generation or as a first generation college student, I faced this challenge in education. And because of this challenge, I chose to work at a community college to help people like me, not have to face these challenges. I'm using challenge a lot here. This is not a good example, but you get what I'm trying to say. Like I'm trying to say that you can weave these moments, these identities throughout different pieces of your statement of purpose, but it shouldn't be your sole story. And I did get a question in the Google Doc that stated, someone asked, how can I create a sob story for my statement of purpose or my personal statement? And that's not the purpose of this. They don't want to know your sob story. They don't care about your sob story. They care about who you are, what your challenges were, especially in education, and how you went about tackling those challenges and how you're helping create a more equitable, a better world, a better education system. So they don't care about the sob story. So if you're trying to create a sob story, that's already going to be a rejection right there. So yeah, so don't try to, I guess a lot of people think about the sob story because in undergrad, I feel like that's like kind of like the narrative that most people go the route, right? They go like more of like a personal, because in undergrad, they ask you for a personal statement, they ask you for, and not a statement of purpose, it's a personal statement. So a lot of people resort to sob stories or stories of challenges and so forth. In grad school, that's not the focus. Someone asked if these slides will be available to participants, and they will not. I am recording the session, so you can go back and view it, and I'll be posting this on the YouTube channel for your reference. Someone asked about GRE scores. I'm a computer science major and it falls into STEM category. Can I aim for a higher quantitative reasoning when applying? Yes. So if you are in the STEM field, definitely try to aim for a high score in quant versus verbal or I would say verbal because analytically, you're still going to have to write a dissertation if you're applying for the PhD. So you want to make sure you showcase strong writing skills. But if you are in the STEM field, you definitely want to get a higher score or emphasize the quantitative portion of the grad school application. I am applying for a PhD and have a master's in science degree. Do I have to add a recommendation from a BS professor, or is it okay to have them for only from MS? So yeah, so there's no standard in terms of who you can ask for letters of recommendation. I gave the example of the BS just because that was my experience with this application here. But when I applied for PhD programs, I actually did not ask any of my bachelor's degree people or even my master's degree people actually for letters of rec. Who did I ask? I actually chose a different route. And that was again because I understood my program and what they were seeking, and my number one program was this PhD program that I'm currently in, and they were more interested in practical experience. So it doesn't really matter if you who you ask. It could be from bachelor's, it could be from master's, it could be from your employment, etc. Okay, someone asked, I am just now starting on my applications, due November 15th, and then some are due December 15th. Should I worry? Timeline. No, but you should start now. That's what I recommend. Just because in my experience, I took 4 months for my master's program application, specifically the statement of purpose. And then for my last cycle, the PhD, I started in the summer. And that was because I was applying to 10 to 12 programs too, so just keep that in mind. So start as soon as possible. Okay, so someone's asking, they're referring to when I said, should you write professors or courses that we liked, but would it be a disadvantage if that professor is not taking new students in particular, or if those courses are not available? And no, that's not a disadvantage. Yeah, it's not a disadvantage. So what happens in the committee, and this is just from my take, I haven't never been on a committee. I haven't really asked professors like what's the experience like yet. I'm hoping to get a professor on my YouTube channel to talk about it, but we'll see in the future. But my understanding of how it works is there's going to be a community of people, and usually it first starts off with like the program assistant or something of the department, and they sift through your application just to make sure you meet the qualifications, right, for grad school. And so they review that, and then they move it on to the next phase, which would be like they would submit your essays to, or your application to, professors. In my case, in my program, what I've been hearing is that every professor reads all applications, even if you mention a certain professor that you want to work with it, which in my case, I only mentioned one for this program, and that professor did read it, but like they all read it just to see if they have any interest in you. So even if you don't mention that person in your statement of purpose, for example, there might be someone else that reads your application that might be interested in your work, interested in meeting with you in an interview and seeing if there would be a good fit with you. So for me and most people, it works out where you write your professor and you tell them how that professor aligns with your research, and then that professor ends up being your advisor if you get admitted. So that was my case, and that happened with both the HGSC as well as the PhD program I'm currently in. So it is not a disadvantage. I guess what I'm trying to say here is it is not a disadvantage. It only shows that you are, that you did your homework, right? That you went on their website, that you reviewed their courses, that you reviewed the professors, and that you are interested in their program. So again, for example, like when I applied to the University of Washington, the person that I wrote about in my statement of purpose, that professor wasn't taking students. So they referred me to a different professor who did somewhat similar work as I wanted to do. And that person actually interviewed me, and it was really informal. They were just like, they told me in an email, like, I want to meet with you. The professor that you wanted to work with is not taking students. They're on sabbatical, but I think that your interest and I like your application and I think they match up with mine. Let's meet up. And we ended up meeting up. And it turned out that we were interested in a certain topic, except in different contexts. So she was looking at it in the K through 12 system, and I was looking at it in higher education. So it turned out that we came to consensus that we weren't a good fit, and I ended up getting rejected from the program. But it was because I ended up talking to this professor who I didn't even think about writing about in my statement of purpose, who had an interest in my application, who reviewed my application, and she gave me the opportunity to speak to her and see if we were a good fit. And it turned out we weren't, and we both kind of came to a consensus that we weren't going to be a good fit, and then I got rejected. So that can happen too. So yes, so no disadvantage, just go ahead and write what is on the website. Okay, so how far is it too far? Okay, someone's asking about high school experience and if it's influential in if they should write about that in their statement of purpose. And no, you should stray away from anything before undergrad. So they don't care about your high school. They don't care about when you were a kid and you read a book on science, or when you went to a science museum. That stuff is irrelevant at this point. They don't. That's not showing anything about you in terms of aptitude, right? So so stick with undergrad and moving forward. That's what you should be speaking about. What is a sub story? SOP story. Got it. Okay. Yeah, sub story. I might have said subcategory for your resume or CV. And SOP stands for statement of purpose. Okay, I am in a STEM and I got more in verbal, that's not submitting. Okay, cool. Okay, so someone's asking how to mention gap years in SOP. You can just be honest, right? You can say like, I took a gap year, but I guess it depends. What did you do during that gap years or gap year or gap years? What did you do? Because if you did something like, oh, I went on vacation, then I wouldn't mention that, right? But if you did something like, oh, I took a gap year purposefully because I wanted to gain more insight on marginalized communities in Vietnam. I don't know, I'm making this up here. Then that's something worth telling, right? So think about it. Is it worth telling? And then be open about it, right? Just say like, after undergrad, I chose to take 2 gap years, or I chose to take a gap in my educational journey because I wanted to focus on being an entrepreneur. I wanted to start this business or this nonprofit and blah, 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 blah. Or I wanted to get really involved with my community because my mission and my goal is to return back and make educational changes in my community that I care about. And so I took this gap year so I can volunteer at my local high school, blah, 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 right? So that's kind of how I would go about talking about gap years. In terms of GRE high score, I believe it's a 170 for both sections. Not sure, don't quote me on that, but you can find that information on the GRE website. Any thoughts on shaping applications so that it leads to an interview? Whoa, hold on. Yeah, any thoughts on shaping an application that leads it to an interview? Honestly, I think everything that I'm mentioning here is for that reason, right? The first stage in this process is your application. Like I mentioned, your initial application is your initial interview. And that's going to lead to another interview, right? If you're applying for a PhD, for example, that's where most interviews take place. Research fit is important. So if you don't tell the committee, here's my research, and I can articulate my research topic concisely, and I can articulate it in a sense that makes sense. Because I guess something that I didn't mention is a lot of us, like I did mention this earlier, that we were interested in a lot of topics, right? But for the purpose of statement of purpose, you want to focus on one topic because you want to be concise to the point and you want to showcase that you understand that particular topic. And that's going to lead to an interview because you are telling the committee, here's what I know about this research space through conducting research, through my personal experiences, through reading the literature. And here's questions I still have about this field, this space. And here's who I want to work with to help me fill in those gaps. And here's why I want to join your program, to help me fill those gaps. And that's going to tell the committee or the person reading your application, okay, I want to learn more about this person. I want to learn about their passions. I want to learn about their research and what questions they still have, because maybe I'm the perfect fit for them. Maybe I've already conducted this research or have the experience here that I can help them get to where they want to be. So to answer your question, every little aspect of your application should be formulated to get you to that next step. And the most important piece for the PhD is research fit. Should we contact professors before applying? Yes, you should. It's just a convention. If they don't respond, don't think too much about it. I did that exact same thing. I what's it called? I contacted people, they didn't respond, they gave me a generic answer and so forth. It's just a convention, and I would say it's a good practice. Okay, so I understand now the difference between SOP and personal statement, but as I understand, SOP should be tailored in a creative way, just as a personal statement. No, SOP should not be tailored in a creative way. So if you got a low GRE score, what other aspects of the application are important? So I would say your statement of purpose and if you're applying for a PhD, your experience in research. I try to choose at least 5 to 7 grad programs to apply for for master's programs, but only came up with 4 good fits. Any tips on how to expand options? I would just say do a lot of research. I started off my research with the top programs in my field. And I think like the US News or something like that, like they provide you with the list of top programs in your field and you just Google it. And then I went through every program and looked to see if they were a good fit for me. Okay, so here's the last question before we move on. Is it okay if I describe in CV or SOP my experience with instruments that are not exactly applicable to the PhD program I am applying to? Example, working with chemistry equipment when applying to a physics program. Just an example, looking at instruments. I would say yes, because at least that showcases that you have knowledge of what it's like to work in a lab. Maybe you frame it in that sense. You don't strictly frame it as a chemistry equipment lab, right? You frame it as a science lab. So framing matters here. So frame it in terms of a science lab versus strictly chemistry, strictly physics. Okay, let's move on. Let me see. So it's 11:43 and I want to be done by 12. I'm gonna, I still have a lot here, but okay, because I am answering questions throughout, I'm gonna forego the Q&A at the end just because we're running out of time here, but I'm gonna talk about a few things. So I'm gonna talk about quantifying your stories. So what does this mean? So when you're writing your statement of purpose, your story must and should contain measurable quantities instead of just stories, so the reader can understand the depth of your experiences. So here's an example of a non-quantifiable story. So the person wrote, during my engineering days, I helped a local NGO by joining as a math tutor, where I taught basic math concepts to school children. Okay, so this is a good start, right? It tells us a couple of things. It tells us that this person is potentially an engineer. It tells us that this person has experience in the field. They're working at their local NGO. And it's telling us that they are maybe proficient or advanced in math. But we need more detail. I want to know more as a reader. Like I just told you all the questions I could have, all the assumptions I'm making. So when you're writing your statement of purpose, don't leave anything up for assumption. So here's a better way to write this in terms of quantifying the story. So during my second year of engineering, I joined Teach Math, a local NGO where I was a part of the math tutoring team. For a period of 10 months, I taught basic math like algebra, geometry, and arithmetic, to more than 30 fifth and sixth grade students. And every single student I taught secured an A in math that year. I've never been prouder in my life. So now we see, those questions, we see answers to those questions that I had, right? So we see that this person in second year of his engineering job. We see that the local NGO this person's writing about, or this person's working with, is called Teach Math. We see that they're part of the math tutoring team and that they worked for 10 months and taught algebra, geometry, arithmetic, and that he taught 30 people, 30 students. And because of his teaching, these students were able to get an A, right? So as a committee member, this is telling me a couple things. So one thing is, it's telling me that this person, so Teach Math, for example, this NGO, maybe as a committee member and as a faculty member, I also work with Teach Math. And, Teach Math is part of my research projects. So as a committee member, I'm going to be like, oh, you know what? Okay, this person has experience with Teach Math. I want to get to know them more. Like, what was their experience like? Maybe they're able to, if I accept them, they're able to help me with my research on Teach Math. So you want to make sure you name drop and be specific and detailed when you're describing your experiences, because connections like that could happen, right? Even if you mention like a person that's in your network and you're like, oh, under the mentorship of this faculty member at my undergraduate institution, I worked on this research project. If that faculty member, especially because you're applying to programs in your field, faculty talk, faculty attend conferences, faculty go to similar conferences. And so if you mention this person in your SOP and that person has this connection with that faculty member, they're going to look at your application more in depth. And that kind of happened with me as well, because my current advisor for my PhD program used to work in Washington, even though she's in San Diego now. And she actually knows a lot of people that I know in my network that I work with. And so we had this connection, and during my interview with her, we spoke about these connections. And she knew that because I mentioned some of my mentors in my statement of purpose. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is be detailed in your responses. And then again, the quantifiable part is, now we know that this person has experience for 10 months. Now we know that this person has experience with 30 fifth and sixth grade students. We know that this person can drive results, right? All of his students secured an A. And if you're going into education, and if this was for education in particular, this is telling me like, okay, this person knows how to teach because all of his students got A's. This person is really has this, this competency for math, or at least algebra, geometry, and arithmetic. So that's shown me a lot as a reader. All right. So the next thing is the right stories, not statements. So storytelling evokes emotion and emotionally connects the reader to the applicant. These documents that we read here, they're documents, right? They're not an interview. You don't show your personality. You don't show your face. You don't show your mannerism and stuff like that, right? So because this is your interview, the way you go about evoking that emotion is through storytelling. But again, I want to emphasize this should not be a sob story. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm just saying bring life to your experience. So here's an example of a statement. I used to work in a multinational software company in the development team, and I had to do the same job every day, code stuff. There was nothing new for me to learn at work, and there was nothing very exciting about going to the office. One day, I decided that I had to get out of there. So I applied to college to study higher courses and get a better job. So that's a statement that it's not that bad. It's not that bad. But when I was reading it, the first time I read it, I didn't get, I guess, there was no emotion that came out of me. I was just kind of like, okay, so we see the facts. This person doesn't like their job. So they went to school. Cool. So here's how you modify it to tell a story and evoke that emotion. Late in the night one Monday, I had found myself in the middle of a deserted office and 15,000 lines of code. Full of caffeine in my bloodstream and an empty life beyond my office, I realized the computer started coding my brain and controlling my life. no longer wanting to let the machine feed on me, I decided that college would be my salvation. So this right here is painting a better picture of the experience, right? It's telling me that this person was maybe depressed or sad and they wanted to get out of that mundane environment. And that college would provide additional, let's see, insight into maybe the field, or maybe this person wants to switch fields. And so this would be a great start to a statement of purpose, actually. It's, quick to the point, and then I'm expecting like this person in the next couple of paragraphs to talk about, maybe a little bit about their coding and what happened there and how they shifted either to a different career or how they're maybe wanting to go back to school to gain more insight into how code could be transformed, how that field could be transformed to improve, I don't know, office culture or something. I don't know. Honestly, I don't know what this person wrote beyond this, but that's kind of what I'm expecting if they were to write a full statement of purpose. So I want you to do something similar in your statement of purpose. Don't just state, oh, I used to work at this NGO. Oh, I used to work as a director of this program. Tell me stories, like tell me your student stories. Tell me a story like where you, I don't know, you saw a student go through a challenge and then they ended up, overcoming that challenge. Tell me that brief story. Again, I'm saying brief, concise, to the point. We don't want to know every single detail about the student life, just the main topic that relates to your theme. All right, let's go and look at questions. Someone's asking, what other aspects of the application does the committee look at if you're applying to master's programs? I would say again, your statement of purpose, how you tell your story, why do you want to pursue a master's program? What's the purpose of that? If you got low GRE scores, and also and through there you can show like if you have experience in research, emphasize that, because that's going to show that you have your quantitative, that you improve on your quality, or that you have quantitative skills. But also if you did a major in engineering, like what drove you to, or any STEM major, I'm assuming engineering here, I think you mentioned engineering, I'm not sure, I forgot, but or computer science. But why did you decide to choose computer science, and talk about that journey? And yeah, like I think a lot of and then also something that I haven't mentioned yet, and I should have earlier, but like you want to speak to the current trends in your field. So for example, education, a lot of it is surrounding equity. So if you're not speaking about equity or some type of equity work or some type of equity line of thinking in your statement of purpose, that can be a hindrance, because it's showing the community that you're not knowledgeable about the current topics, the current hot topics in our field, right? And even HGSC as a whole emphasizes equity anyways, or eradicating educational inequality. If you're not focusing on those topics, then that's just going to be a difficult process for you in terms of getting admission. So to answer your question here, I would say think about why you're considering a master's in your program, in your field, and what are the hot themes, hot topics that are currently being asked, the hot questions that are currently being asked in that field, and work with that. And that's going to show the committee like, okay, this person does have a low GRE score on the verbal, but they're thinking really critically about the hot topics in our field. So I want to take a closer look at other aspects of the application. I want to invite them to an interview. I want to connect with them. Blah 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 blah. So I would look at other ways to overcome these low GRE scores. In terms of hiring me for a coaching session, I only offer statement of purpose review jobs. So yeah, I don't offer like Zoom calls, just because I am a PhD student too, and I don't have, I do a lot of things. I do the YouTube, I am a PhD student, I take coursework, I do research, I volunteer, and I have other things that I do as well. So I don't have time for the coaching, but I do offer the statement of purpose review service. Yeah, so someone's asking about the paid service, can we resubmit for final feedback? And no, so I only do, so you would have to submit, and you would have to pay again. Just because I do work hard on these and I read these like whenever you submit a job to me, like I'll read them like multiple times, different days. And I provide extensive feedback. And depending on how much work I think the SOP needs, sometimes it takes me a longer time. So if I provide a resubmission service for free, I guess I want to monetize my time, the time that I do put into this, because I don't just like look at it for 30 minutes and that's it. I look at it for multiple days, read it multiple times, and provide the best insight I could possibly give you. And sometimes I provide outlines depending on how much work is needed. Okay, so we are actually nearing the end. It's 11:56 and I want to be finished by noon. So I'm not going to be able to share the example with you all because of time constraints, but if you have any questions, I'm going to stick around until noon. Feel free to ask me your questions in the chat and I will keep responding. But if not, then I just want to thank you all for being here. Hopefully this session really helped you with your applications. I do plan on making other videos focused on my Harvard application that I do have. And obviously these tips are not just for Harvard specifically. You can take these tips for every program in graduate school. And so I'm going to be showing things like, I'm going to read my letters of rec that I have here and how you can ask for letters of rec. I'm going to be talking about different aspects of the application and so forth, just because I do have the whole application here in hand. And I'll be making other videos on different topics as well. But and then I'm also going to start inviting people, different scholars to the channel to talk about their journeys, their tips, and etc. in the near future. So go subscribe if you're not subscribed. But thank you for being here. Ask your questions. I'll be here till noon. But if not, have a great day and I will see you in the next video. Okay, there's a question in the chat here that says, could the samples be sent to our emails or shown in your YouTube channel? Again, thank you for sharing. Yeah, actually, it's a good idea. Maybe because there was 2 of you that sent me your statement of purposes for revision, and obviously we didn't have time here. I think what I'll do, I'll ask for permission first, and then if they allow me to, then I'll do the live review as a video. Okay, one more question. So was that example for the quality writing SOP or PA? Which example are you speaking about? Was that example for quality writing from SOP or PA? Or personal statement? To me, it is a creative way of writing. Okay. Oh yeah. So that's just an example in terms of it didn't have to relate to any of those. It was just an example of how to go about quantifying and evoking emotion through your writing. So yes, I do see your point in terms of how it's a creative way of writing, because I do agree it is a creative way of writing, but I think I see it more in a sense of the evoking emotion. Instead of stating facts, you are telling a story. So for me, creative way of writing would be being like abstract or let's see, or kind of writing like a non-fiction or a fictional story, right? Like I'm thinking like young adult literature, stuff along those lines. That's what I'm thinking more about in terms of creative writing. This is more of, and I think about the statement of purpose as an academic piece, and then personal statement more of a story where you can be creative. Cool. Any other questions? It's noon. I'll stick around for like 5 more minutes. Yep. Thank you for being here. Yeah, go ahead and ask your questions here. I'll stick around for a little bit longer. Okay, so for PhD, is it okay to write in this storytelling manner? I thought it's how it should. No. So the PhD is, I mean, the statement of purpose for a PhD, first I would suggest that you need to read the prompt and you need to answer the questions based on what they're asking. And usually they're asking about, they usually ask like a generic question like, tell me about your experiences and how that led to your decision to pursue graduate studies, in this case, a PhD. So they don't want to know about, I don't know, like when you were little and you were at the library and you saw these books and you wanted to become a librarian. They don't want to know that stuff. They want to know, in undergrad, did you conduct research and did that research influence your decision to pursue graduate school? Did you take a course to help you decide what you wanted to research? So for example, let's say you took like a, say, maybe you took like a woman's, like a feminism course in undergrad and you're like, damn, like I see all these, I'm reading this literature, I'm reading these books, I'm reading all this course content, and I, what's it called? And I don't agree with these arguments that these scholars who are super old and who have these different contexts or blah, 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 like I don't agree with their arguments. I want to go to grad school because I want to advance this field. I think this field is outdated. I think this field needs new perspectives. So I want to go to grad school because of that reason. And that's what that's what I would talk about in your statement of purpose. You would say like, I took this course that was focused on feminism, and I noticed that all these scholars were from the 1960s and they were living in during World War II. I don't even know my math here, but like blah 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 blah, right? And so I want to make sure that a perspective of, a new perspective is shown, blah 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 blah, right? So where are you filling in the gap? So that's what they want to know in your statement of purpose. They don't want to know, oh, like like here's my story. I was a student in K through 12, and one day my teacher gave me an F because you know what I mean? Like you know what I'm trying to say? Like they there has to be purpose for what you're writing in terms of what you're telling in your story. Will the recording of this presentation be available to us? It will be on the YouTube channel. How do we reach out to you for your service? So there is a link on my YouTube channel. It's through Fiverr, and on there you can find like the price and other things, and you can find that on most descriptions of my videos. Or you can also reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I can send you the link directly to there. And you can find my LinkedIn account attached to my YouTube page. For SOP is, I have to talk about my background information about family and attitudes. So you do not have to talk about your background information. I think it depends on your field, right? So for example, I think you were the one that was speaking about like a STEM field. Traditionally in those type of fields, you don't really talk about your background in terms of, first generation, I come from this culture background, etc. I typically when I read statement of purposes for like STEM, I don't see that embedded in the statement of purpose, only because that's not what the faculty, that's not what matters to faculty, unfortunately. Unless you're talking about like, I want to provide more access to women of color in STEM. That's a different route. It just depends on what your theme is, right? But traditionally, if you're looking at something that's not related to that type of topic in terms of STEM programs, then there's no need to talk about family background. I do think though that by mentioning things like, oh, I'm Latino, my family's from Mexico, I do think that those type of cultural identities, even if you briefly state them, do make you unique. Because if your field is very standard in terms of most people in my field, and I'm going to use the computer science here, and maybe I'm being stereotypical here, but like from what I heard and what I've seen, most computer science graduate programs, the people that are in those programs, are of a certain background, right? So if you can make yourself stand out in terms of your identities, that could be a great way to go about it, but you don't need to give like a elaborate explanation of here's my background and here's who I am, you know, because that's not relevant to STEM. I think for education, we do take that into consideration. We do, like I mentioned earlier, because I know my space really well, equity, advancement of underrepresented students and marginalized students, that's a big focus in education now. Racism, all those topics are big in the field of education. And if you're not feeding to those fields, then you're kind of doing like an injustice to yourself in terms of some of these applications. So I think again, I guess just to finalize here, know your field, know what matters to them, and use that to mold your SOP. So I would say in this case, STEM, I would focus more on the practical end, your experiences in research or experiences in computer science or whatever field you're talking about, your engineering aptitude, your competency in the field, whatever it is. That's what I would focus on. And then the opposite would be for education, you want to talk about the challenges, you know, the racism, the cultural backgrounds, the advancement of educational opportunities for marginalized people, etc. Yeah, yeah, my name, Ivan, is popular in Russia. I got that a lot growing up. All right, so we're past the 5. I'm gonna get off of here, but I'm hoping that this helped out. I will put out this webinar as a whole on the channel, and then I'm also gonna like snip it into certain parts as other videos as well, in case you're like, I don't want to watch the whole thing. I'm gonna like break it down into different sections. And I'll be posting these as we progress here on the channel. So go ahead and subscribe there and watch the videos if you want to rewatch this. But yeah, have a good day, and I will see you all in the next video.